It's all right. All right, so we have the webinar live, which means people will be trickling in. Okay. Well, we're going to get started very soon. Just give a few more seconds for people to trickle in, and then we will get started with our program today. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started because we'll get to the conversation in a little bit. So first of all, I want to say happy Friday to everyone who's joining us today. Welcome, and thanks to all of you for taking your lunchtime to join us for our conversation today. My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. And we are a member of 3 national networks, the Global Ties US, the World Affairs Councils of America, and Sister Cities International. Our organization facilitates a variety of international professional and youth exchanges, speaker programs, and educational opportunities for the Kentuckiana region year-round. So today's program is in partnership with the World Affairs Councils of America and will conclude WACA's Climate Week 2021 series. So in honor of Earth Week this week, the World Affairs Councils across the US are convening 5 days of virtual programming that feature high caliber global and local experts on this most critical issue facing our world, climate change. Our program today is titled Advocating for Climate Change, Grassroots Actions for a Sustainable World. This conversation will feature Keya Chatterjee, Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, and moderated by Lane Boldman, Executive Director of the Kentucky Conservation Committee. So USCAN is an affiliate network of the Climate Action Network International, a worldwide network of more than 1,100 NGOs in more than 90 countries, all working to promote government, private sector, and individual action to limit human-induced climate change to ecologically sustainable levels. Keya Chatterjee is the Executive Director of USCAN and author of the book, The Zero Footprint Baby, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby. Her work focuses on building an inclusive movement in support of climate action. Keya's commentary on climate change policy and sustainability issues has been quoted in dozens of media outlets, including USA Today, the New York Times, Fox News, the Washington Post, and NBC Nightly News. Prior to joining USCAN, Keya served as Senior Director for Renewable Energy and Footprint Outreach at the World Wildlife Fund, a climate change specialist at USAID, and at NASA headquarters for 4 years, communicating research results on climate change. The moderator for our conversation today is Lane Boldman. Lane is the Executive Director of the Kentucky Conservation Committee, which is a state-based conservation and policy collaborative established in 1975, whose mission is to provide trusted voice to the public in Kentucky's capital and throughout Kentucky, effectively advocating for protection, restoration, and sustainable use of natural resources for the equitable benefit of all citizens in the Commonwealth. Lane has been working on environmental advocacy issues in Kentucky and nationally since 1992, and has been with the Kentucky Conservation Committee since 2014. Her background includes working as the Advocacy and Outreach Coordinator for the Kentucky Environmental Foundation, and as a leader in multiple positions for the Sierra Club. Lane currently serves on the Lexington Corridors Commission and previously served on the board of Citizens Coal Council, working to empower citizens affected by the impacts of mining and coal, the board of the U.S. Green Building Council Kentucky Market Leadership, and the board of the Kentucky Solar Energy Society. So we are absolutely delighted to have you both today. And before I turn it over to Lang to start our conversation, I just want to remind everyone that you can submit your questions at any time during our conversation, and certainly use the Q&A button or chat box for any other comments you might have. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lang to begin our conversation today. Lang?
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate being connected to your organization, and love to hear more about your work, and appreciate you acknowledging Earth Day and your programs all this week. So, we'd love to get questions during this segment. Keya and I met each other probably about 6-7 years ago when I joined the U.S. Climate Action Network. And I had just come off a stint with being on the national board of the Sierra Club for about 6 years, and wanted to stay connected to as many networks as possible in the role that I transitioned into for the Kentucky Conservation Committee. So, Keya, I'd love for you to talk about the big picture of all the great work that U.S. Climate Action Network is doing, and some of the great teams that are involved in the network, and how it's a great place for large organizations like Sierra Club and small organizations like Kentucky Conservation Committee to come together and share their expertise. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Lane. And it's always nice to be in space with you. So thank you. So USCAN is the US part of this very large international network. And just within the US, we have about 200 organizations. And then from each organization, we have a couple people who participate more deeply in our network. And sometimes more than a couple people. For bigger organizations like the Sierra Club, we have up to 10 people participating, but we've got a couple people who are really what we call our voting participants, the people who are deeply engaged in the network. And our way of working is that we really believe that we are going to get more done on the climate crisis if we are really connected to each other and we have relationships to each other. And those relationships allow us to be aligned, and that alignment allows us to do things together and change things in the world. And our way of thinking is that we have to connect all of the great activists around the country that are within organizations, big or small, as you said, whatever organization size. We want people to be connected to each other so that we can really leverage each other's resources and be a lot more powerful together than we could be on our own, using a network model. And so we give grants out to our smaller member organizations. And when I say we, it's actually our members that do that. So it's peer reviewed. Our members come together and say, like, who needs resources and how can we give those out. We also have teams that our members vote on every year of topics that people want to work on together. And so Lane was just selected as the MVP, the most valuable player, for one of our action teams that it was working on elections last year. But we have every year our members are voting on what do we want to work on together across organizations across the country. And then we have teams that are cross-organizational teams that advance work together over the course of each year. And then we vote again the next year. So it's intended to be a really bottom-up process where we're really hearing from our members who are organizers in their own community what makes sense for everyone to be working on, and how do we spend the resources that we get together as a network.
Yeah, and that's been one of the great things about the network as well, is not just the information that I can bring back to Kentucky, but information I can share about Kentucky to the groups. Kentucky has some real challenges. It's a highly coal-intensive state that's changing dramatically, hopefully very soon. And it's great to hear the stories firsthand about the climate challenges that people are dealing with. When I explain that there are areas of Eastern Kentucky that continually don't have water because it's been compromised by all the mining activity, a lot of my fellow activists may not have heard those stories, and it's important to get those out. Just as I was hearing from some of our team members about climate migration that's already happening for people that live in island areas or have international connections where sea level rise is already creating huge problems. So it's great to hear those stories one-on-one, that it's not filtered through the media. And the great thing about USCAN is that it's also a great place to vet issues such as carbon tax, to see how people are aligned, because I know that's an issue that there's different opinions on how to handle that. And I had been really dependent upon my Sierra Club network for a lot of alignment, but when I get into USCAN, I have an even broader perspective because you also include a lot of international representation. If you'd like to talk more about that and the work you're doing on the Paris Climate Agreement, that would be great.
Yeah, so Climate Action Network is a liaison to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the UN climate talks are sort of why USCAN was invented and why WACA International was invented. So back in 1989, the international community was beginning to have regular talks about the climate crisis. And so we were formed because we felt we needed to have a place where folks could work across organizations on these issues. So we were really, since 1989, working towards getting a global agreement on climate change. And so securing the Paris Climate Agreement was a really important moment from our network, because it was why we were invented, and we had been working on it for a very long time across countries. And at those UN meetings, we have somebody from USCAN who is elected by other USCAN members, who goes to the international meetings and coordinates our members who are there, but then also coordinates with the teams that come from every other Climate Action Network node. And so together we are able to see the picture of what are the different issues that different countries are facing, and how can we together have the most just outcome. It really, I think, historically has even been a bigger part of what we've done than it is today. Today, yes, we do all of that work, but we also do a lot of that alignment you were talking about, Lane, where we say like, okay, where are people on a carbon tax? And we find interesting things, right? I think that's one thing that maybe is counterintuitive to people, that our membership actually does not particularly prefer that approach. And so we make our poor members fill out these very long surveys twice a year, but they're for good reason, because we can really see over time, where is our membership aligned and where are we misaligned? And so carbon tax is an interesting example, because what we've seen is that even though in academia, in kind of the public domain, it's a very popular approach, within our membership, it's a very unpopular approach. For a lot of reasons. One is that, what people need in our communities, as you were saying, Lane, in your community, people need access to clean water. In my community, people need access to bus service. We've seen during the pandemic, like essential workers have been continuing to take the bus. They've gotten really crowded, and we just don't have enough bus service. And so whatever that need is, it can be certainly indirectly met through a carbon tax, but what we actually want is the clean water. What we actually want is more bus service. And so what we see as our membership really coalescing around, actually what we want is something much more akin to what we are seeing in the American Jobs Plan that just came out, but at a much bigger scale. And so we also work with different tables that go across networks. So we ourselves are a network, and then we work with something called the Green New Deal Network, which has about 10 networks within it. Some that are focused on housing policy, some that are focused on some that are trade unions, et cetera. And so we come together there and have been advancing something called the Thrive Act, which is like the American Jobs Plan that Biden put out this week, but is actually 3 times at the scale. And that's because what we looked at is, what do we actually need in order to meet the challenges our communities are facing and to take on the climate crisis, where we know that we are having to deal with whole communities burning down in large fires, which we've been warning about for decades, getting last year into the Greek alphabet in terms of hurricane names, because we're having such a high frequency of hurricanes. And so So looking at what do we actually need in order to deal with this, and how can we take this moment and reimagine how this country works so that it's in a sustainable way that isn't causing the climate crisis. That scale is something we put forward through a piece of legislation that's going to drop called the Thrive Act. And that's really another way that our members come together, even not just like within our network, but even then beyond that. And then the way we do that is similar to how I described with the UN talks. We have members within USCAN that represent USCAN at the larger tables where we sit.
Yeah, and the thing about networking, it's so important because we're a small organization, but we segment ourselves into a certain role. Our focus is trying to make sure that our allies and the grassroots activists are connected well to their state government, that I'm keeping them informed on what the current issues are or what the conversations are happening at the state capitol. And then so that we're not replicating work, that I can distribute information to everybody, and then they can ask back, what's the priority? What should we be doing? They can still form their own opinions on issues, but our organization tries to help give them the landscape that is most favorable for their issue. And then at the same time, we work within a whole lot of smaller networks. We have a solar advocacy network that has about a dozen nonprofits that are working on different issues dealing with Kentucky solar, rooftop solar, community solar. Most recently, merchant solar has been coming into state. There's 20 proposals that have come up in the last year for merchant solar, and that creates a whole different set of issues for other networks I'm involved in, like land conservation. So I'm having conversations between my land conservation folks and my solar folks on how we can bring those issues together and not be competing or doing it in ways that are most sustainable. So again, that's really helpful when you have an umbrella group like US Climate Action Network, where other states have already wrestled with some of these problems. And some great models in Virginia. There's great models in Wisconsin on how they've been, in North Carolina, where they've been dealing with land use and solar use at the same time. So it's very helpful. The other side is, where are the challenges? And for us, networks are great, but a lot of times I have multiple volunteers within the same different networks. It's the same 20 people that are doing double, triple, quadruple tasks. What are some of the challenges that you run into?
Well, I mean, this year obviously has had its own unique challenges the last 12 months. I think that one of our biggest challenges over the last 12 months was I was saying that sort of the base of our work is relationships and connectivity. And that's the base from which we can do work together. And I think it has been hard not to be able to physically gather together. And what we've seen is that our members actually don't feel as close to each other as they do when we're able to physically get together each year. And there's all kinds of, collaborative projects that emerge just from physically being in the same space periodically. And so that's definitely been a big challenge for us in the last year. Obviously, we've continued to do all of our programming remotely, but I do think that it's going to be really important once we can do so safely. To get people together again, because it is really, it makes a disagreement over something much, much easier to work through if you have that basis of relationship. And so just this year, the United States President Biden announced a target for emissions reductions as an example. So announced that the United States would attempt to reduce emissions 50 to 52%. So we have a lot of USCAN members that are very, very disappointed in that, because if you calculate what the United States should be doing from a perspective of what is our capacity, so what is our GDP, what kind of resources do we have, understanding we have a lot of domestic inequality, but how many resources do we have relative to other countries? And then what is our responsibility for this crisis? So, as Lane, you were saying, there are whole countries that will have to take down their flag from in front of the UN because we've let this crisis go without dealing with it for so many decades. And so what is our responsibility? It's very large. We've contributed a lot of the historic emissions. So based on that, we had members come together and calculate that actually the United States is responsible for something like 195% reduction in the next decade. And so we can't do that here, but what we could do is contribute to other countries being able to go through this transition in order to meet our responsibility. And so a lot of our members of USCAN felt that, this number was inadequate. Other members felt like it's a good starting point. And just dealing with those tensions is so much easier when you have really strong relationships. And luckily we have years of relationships that we've built on. But I think for us, like a massive challenge has been not being able to really deepen those relationships by getting together that once a year, and sometimes more than once a year, because sometimes the action teams also have smaller meetings throughout the year. And then I would say on the grassroots organizing front, we also have a project called Arm in Arm, where we've been organizing people to take really, to really organize in the model of mass movements, in the model of the Indian independence movement, in the model of the US civil rights movement, which is the scale we think will be needed ultimately in this country if we really want to do the things that need to be done to protect our communities around the climate crisis. And so that organizing obviously has been like super challenging under COVID, but what we found is that there are people who are willing to step up. And we know from polling that actually there are lots of people who want to get more engaged. But it's been a little bit hard and slower to move during COVID. And then I think also organizing becomes hard, even especially, when an administration changes to one that actually does want to do something. It actually is counterintuitively a little bit harder to recruit people because people think, oh, it's kind of taken care of now. But in fact, we have massive challenges. Even in this administration, they're still supporting the Line 3 pipeline, for example, in northern Minnesota, which goes through Ojibwe land. Wild rice fields are going to be covered in tar sands oil, which is in violation of a treaty that we have with that indigenous nation, with that tribe. And so we have these struggles on the ground, and then we also have the overarching push to actually get things locked in, so that what we have isn't just words, but actually like laws that are in place. Because to this day in this country, we do not have any national laws that regulate the pollution that causes climate change, and we never have. And that has to change. And so we need to have a mass movement to make that happen. And recruitment is another challenge, I would say, of the last year, just because it's been a tough year on all of us. Let's be honest.
It has, but that's why I was so glad to see USCAN initiate the Arm in Arm initiative, because, I think the movement came to terms with the fact in the last couple decades that this isn't just environmentalists. This is not just an environmental problem. This is a world problem. This is a justice problem, an equity problem, and USCAN has taken the lead in really setting the tone for how equity and justice and environmental protections all work together, and it's absolutely essential. So Arm in Arm, I think, creates a really good window for people that may not think right away, well, I'm not an environmentalist, this isn't for me. But it doesn't have to be. You don't have to be an environmentalist. You're trying to survive and have a just world where your voice is heard and understood, and people realize more that the impacts, if you're not being impacted by something, someone else is. Even with our solar issue, we have had people raise concerns with who's getting the money for these projects, who's benefiting from these projects. Is it going to impact my land or my neighbor's land? And the questions are all the same, whether it's power we like to see or energy we don't like to see. It's a way of we need to be managing how we treat people and how these changes affect them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beginnings of how we talk about this Arm in Arm effort to organize, really, and I saw in the chat the comment about health, is really just that everybody deserves clean air. Everybody deserves clean water, a healthy food supply, a stable home, decent work, a livable future. And that there's a reason that those things have been put at risk. It is because, you know, powerful people have been willing to sacrifice certain communities, predominantly, not only, but predominantly, if you look nationally, predominantly that is Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities that people have been willing to sacrifice in order to make a profit. And we've had a lot of politicians willing to do their bidding, regardless of how our communities are getting abused in the process. And so, I mean, the beautiful thing is, of course, that we also have an incredible legacy in this country of meeting, you know, massive challenges and coming together and, you know, dealing, you know, taking down Jim Crow in the South. And, you know, we're not done with any of these things, taking down fascism during World War II, but we do have this legacy of coming together to overcome big challenges. And that is really like the scale of challenge we are facing with the climate crisis right now, something we're really going to have to come together and organize around in order just to protect ourselves and our communities.
Yeah, and even more importantly, keeping our own house in order. I mean, even within the environmental community, there's a recognition that we need to rethink about our structures. Before I left the Sierra Club board several years ago, we passed our equity and inclusion statement, and you know, making sure that we are really putting the grassroots forward. And the same with how U.S. Climate Action Network is structured, that the small groups get the votes. The small organizations are the ones that are really in charge. And that really, to me, creates a very rich dynamic on how people are treated, how we all make decisions together, and that these issues stay out in front. I mean, the reason I got so involved in the environmental movement was, among other things, mountaintop mining issues in Eastern Kentucky, a huge problem and legacy pollution to this day. And Kentucky has certainly done their part in contributing to the climate crisis with all of the coal we have. So it's important for people to see these issues from the bottom up, where people are living right in their own local communities, and be able to make those kind of statements that are heard, and lift up those voices. And I encourage people to put other questions in the chat. But do you want to say anything more before we start moving to Q&A? We'll let people collect questions for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I'll just share also in the chat the link to the where folks can sign up for a training with Arm in Arm. If folks want to get more engaged, the next training is coming up on April 30th. And the website is arminarmforclimate.org if folks are interested in engaging yourselves.
Yeah, and I see a friend of mine, Colleen Kalin, flagged health problems with climate change. Certainly a big issue. Like I said, the Eastern Kentucky issue, when you don't have clean water, you don't have adequate housing, and it's all from a history of you know, denigration and communities not having their own voice and having to deal with stock housing from coal companies. It affects your health. It affects your mental health. And so, you know, things that U.S. Climate Action Network is wrestling with also is how this plays out on the international stage. And if you want to address that as well, Keya.
Yeah, I mean, so you could almost take any country as an example. So I'll just pick a country. So take Mozambique. We have a country where there was a massive, unprecedented level flooding a few years ago. And then afterwards, the infrastructure was so decimated that there was a typhoid outbreak. So massive number of deaths from an immediate health impact that came from flooding. And then another massive storm hit. And, you know, it's some of the most heartbreaking video footage I've ever seen is people standing on roofs, just begging to be taken by helicopter out of there. There were only 5 helicopters that came. They were from South Africa, and many people were left on those roofs and died. And, you know, even today, the health repercussions of that remain. And so there's obviously there's massive air quality impacts from the burning of fossil fuels that causes, a health catastrophe. Really here as well as around the world. The same kinds of things we see in the global South, we see in the United States because we have so much domestic inequality. But you really, it's through health and water, I think, where most people really experience the climate crisis. Not everyone, for some people like particularly like in Australia and the Western US, there's very large fires. But for a lot of people, which of course, again, affects air quality. But for a lot of people, the intersection is around access to clean water, getting compromised and around health repercussions of the climate crisis, which are so varied, from like vector-borne diseases to air quality to, we know that heat has a massive effect when you have periods of long periods of heat. It has really, really bad effects on heart disease, not only on asthma, but permanent effects in many communities. And so dealing with that is the intersection through which I think most people actually experience the climate crisis.
Yeah, and I see there's a question here about how to address the displacement of workers in traditional but polluting industries such as coal miners. And, that's one of the biggest challenges in the work I do, kind of being a conduit to state government, dealing with a lot of these legislators in their own communities. It's one of the things that drove me into this work, because a just transition means you really have to get into the weeds. You have to be in the communities. You have to let those people talk and give their ideas. And that's challenging when there are already pre-constructed powers in some ways required dismantling, or they need to step back. Just as I mentioned earlier about large organizations like Sierra Club are not the front of U.S. Climate Action Network. They're actually, more advisory. In our case, we have lawmakers who are dealing with people's day-to-day problems. The coal miners are now down to only 3,000 employed from a high of 70,000 at one time out in eastern and western Kentucky. And you can't ask people to trade their job of today for a job of tomorrow that isn't there yet. And so you have to take the time. I go out, to these areas and I talk to people one-on-one. To me, that's the only way you deal with that, to really understand the situation. And I can see why a lot of politicians will, in desperation, start proposing large projects that are in some ways every bit as polluting. We have a situation where a lawmaker has passed some legislation that it attracts data centers. Well, data centers are hugely energy intensive industry. And the question is, are we going to use that to continue to prop up coal because that's where the jobs still are remaining for a little while? Or are we going to use it to also bring out solar farms to these same regions and reemploy people in new industries and get the energy from a sustainable resource? And these are real questions. And we're kind of at a tipping point right now with that, I think, in Kentucky, where it could go either way. A few years ago, the rush was from coal to gas. And I think that it's helpful to make sure that people are keeping up with the latest developments, because the whole energy landscape has changed so quickly and people are still relying on old information for a lot of this. So having these networks that we're all working in are really important for keeping current on information, because there's environmentalists I know that are still learning about a lot of these issues and the intricacies that have been doing this work for 30 years and more. So and I just want to remind people again to put questions in the chat. I see there's a question that says, which countries are best positioned to support climate change through their policies? I'll throw that one to you, Keya.
Yeah, so ironically, the countries that are most vulnerable have really stepped up and been doing the most. Obviously, we've had a lot of domestic challenges in the US that have prevented us from really meeting our responsibilities and the opportunities here. Again, like if you have government programs, then we can get people into careers, et cetera. But I do think that there is a disproportionate number of small island nations of least developed countries that are doing incredible work on what we call the mitigation side, so reducing the pollution that's causing climate change, and on the adaptation side, preparing for climate impact. So like in Bangladesh, it's probably the best in class response to flooding of anywhere. That I've seen, because they have been able to put in place really community-led efforts that are warning systems where community members warn other community members. And they have really just like, in the United States, you've probably seen like if there's a flood coming, all you get is a massive traffic jam and no one can go anywhere. But they've really figured out how to do that kind of evacuation very quickly. And get people made whole again. Obviously Europe is far ahead of the United States in terms of just use of public transportation, lower use of vehicles, higher use of solar, higher use of wind. They're not there yet, but they're far ahead of the United States. And then I would say like most countries in the global South just have more experience living sustainably. And if you look like pre-colonialism, you had a lot of societies that really knew how to live in balance with the earth. And then the introduction of European colonialism into these societies brought polluting ways of working and polluting systems. And so when you go around the world, what you see is so many examples of communities that know how to thrive without causing pollution, that really understand how to live on the land.
Yeah, I see there's questions rolling in now. I see my friend Bill Miller is letting people know, if interested in various climate change interviews and experts, such as Jane Goodall, please tap into globalconnectionstelevision.com. I've been on that program. It's a great program. And then Lydia Lewis is asking, the United Mine Workers Union came out earlier this week in support of the transition to clean energy and exchange it for jobs. What are your thoughts? That is a good example of organizing long-term, looking at the far into the future. Environmental groups and unions have been trying to build a collaborative framework for a long time, and have tried to work in areas where they have common interests as much as possible. Now, the mine workers, that was, of course, a big challenge. But even they recognize at this point that when you've gone from 70,000 jobs down to 3,000 jobs, the trends are not going to reverse. And I say at least about 5 years ago, I think there was a recognition that this has to happen, because you're not going to recover the coal jobs the way they used to be. That's just not in the menu anymore. So the important thing is to put the structures in place so that these coal miners are retrained quickly. A lot of the energy infrastructure jobs that supply coal, a lot of those same talents can be repurposed on any kind of energy, and we hope it's solar and wind. In Kentucky, it's going to be primarily solar, but a lot of the same linemen and installations, and you still have to deal with the electricity grid. A lot of these jobs, not all of them can transition, but there are ways to deal with it. And Keya, if you want to add any more to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say this also is related to what we were talking about before, as an approach to spending in order to solve the climate crisis is easier to create jobs with, just to be totally frank. And that is what we need to do, because people do deserve to have jobs. And so it has been, as Lane said, years of work, but it's really important in this moment for us to actually pass what we're talking about, because people aren't going to trust it if we don't make it real. And so we actually have to make these jobs real. And there's a great example from New York where they were able to create a just transition fund that actually funded the hospitals and the schools and all these things that went through a reduced tax base as jobs were transitioned. And then every single worker was guaranteed a job and got a job at the end of that. Now there's a new struggle to make sure that those are unionized jobs, and not a new struggle, but a continued struggle that we are working on as a community and our members there are working on. But like we have to make it real for people. People actually have to like see and experience the benefits. And I think that we are on the cusp of really doing something big in this country. We are at a crossroads. Like we are going to make a decision. Are we going to go back to what was going on before we really peeled back the onion and saw how much racial injustice there was? Are we going to go back to how it was before COVID, when things were not working? People could not afford the basic necessities in their lives, didn't have clean air, clean water. Or are we going to reimagine the future that we can have in this country? And that is a future that will create a lot of jobs, because it means we have to insulate homes. We need to completely electrify our homes. That's going to create a ton of jobs to electrify homes, to, as Lane, as you were talking about, to get renewable energy. And all of these things are very labor intensive. And so we have an opportunity here that I think is critical.
Yeah, setting up the electrical infrastructure for electric cars. But this is what I'm saying about the time lag. Sometimes people don't realize how fast things are changing. I've heard of conversations with some of the lawmakers I work with. They've been struggling with how to deal with an EV tax for electric cars, because we're used to being funded through the road tax, which is all based on gasoline. And that's a problem they're going to have to address pretty quickly. But even then, I heard a comment from secondhand about a lawmaker who said, well, if you're driving a Tesla, you shouldn't have to worry about the fees so much, as though it's only the rich people that are going to be driving EVs. No. There's already a secondary market for EVs. People are buying used EVs as their second cars. This is not a rich man's purchase anymore. This is going to be an everyday thing, and people are still catching up to that fact. And I just wanted to acknowledge the work that both USCAN has done on the jobs, but also the Blue Green Alliance, which is another great organization that really did this as kind of their signature effort to get the unions working with the green groups. Let's see, we have a question about carbon footprint taxation. Are we considering financial ability of the consumer, producer, corporate profits aspects, and how sustainable is consumption-driven economy that has the greatest impact on polluting the environment? Well, that is a fair question. I mean, I try to tell people, whether it's clean energy or dirty energy, impacts are impacts. Everything has an impact, and our goal should be to make our impact as light as possible, no matter which way, which technology you're using. And if you want to add any more to that, Keya.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there is a great need for us to learn to live a little bit more sustainably. I think, as Gandhi said, we have enough for everybody's need, just not enough for everybody's greed. And in terms of like considering the consumer aspect of this versus the corporate aspect of this is really why the movement has moved away from taxation as an approach and towards investing in our communities as an approach, because people cannot afford to pay their utility bills right now. The energy burden on particularly low-income families is outrageous. So that actually needs to come down. And so I think, economists will say, well, if you make the price go up, people will use less. But the problem is that the people who are responsive to that already have a completely intolerable energy burden. People are coming out of this pandemic with enormous amounts of energy debt. That they really cannot manage and don't have the resources to buy insulation, et cetera. So we actually need to make sure that that we need to move from a society where everyone takes care of themselves to a society where we take care of each other, where we say, like, yes, maybe we do need to tax the wealthy so that we can subsidize insulation for people who cannot afford their energy bills. And we need to make sure that we are always keeping in mind the whole of a person, the whole of a community, and how do we take care of people, even as we take pollution out of the equation, which is one aspect of taking care of people.
Yeah, and a lot of times the incentives are still very backwards to make that happen in a just and equitable way. We've had moratoriums since the pandemic on evictions and late fees on electricity bills, but the utilities don't prioritize a lot of energy efficiency programs because their business model is on production. So, some of these constructs need to be rethought and changed, and that kind of change is not easy. It gets very cumbersome when you have businesses that are old businesses like the utility sector, and they're learning, but they're not learning fast enough. And so, we just have to keep bringing these new business models to their attention and to lawmakers' attentions, and really push for change. It's time for drastic change and whole new systems. And that may sound intimidating, but it's also very exciting. This change in electric cars, it took decades to think it through, but then once the tipping point happened, it's happening fast. So we need to be positioned well for that. I see we have a question from Facebook. Have your priorities changed since you started your work as a climate advocate? I actually started out not as any kind of advocate. My career started as a graphic designer, and I got involved in this work by joining a hiking club. And through that, being out in nature, I started seeing things that bothered me. I started seeing pollution in places where there shouldn't have been pollution. And that's how I became an advocate. And the climate work just became such an imperative from that. And so I don't think my priorities have changed personally. Priorities for my organization, Kentucky Conservation Committee, I think in the 70s and 80s, we were more focused on more traditional nature-based work, and we still are. It's still an important part. Land conservation, wildlife conservation, but certainly the energy sector and the clean power issues and the just transition issues have certainly taken an equal stage, if not a major stage, within that conversation. Keya, what kind of changes have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, my priorities have changed pretty dramatically since starting this work. I started this work I was working at NASA, and I just got really alarmed about what I was seeing in terms of the impact of climate change. Like, we were getting Arctic sea ice data that just looked wrong, and talking to people who worked on other planets, and oh, what happens when a planet loses its polar ice cap? And things change fast. And that's what we're experiencing. And so I switched to focusing on climate change in 2002 because I was deeply alarmed at the Arctic sea ice data I was seeing, and not because I care about ice. I don't particularly have a passion for ice. I find it cold, because I could see what it was going to mean for food supplies and water supplies. And so I think that's how I came to first have a priority on climate, but it took me a while to really change my priorities and understand that this isn't really about just getting climate pollution down. This is a holistic societal change, and this is a political problem. And in fact, it's much more akin to work my grandparents were doing in the Indian independence movement than to anything that I was initially trained as an ecologist. And so, but being trained as a scientist, I really needed to reteach myself a whole other discipline that is really more around social science and how do you make fast and deep change, and what does it look like to transform a society and bring people along and organize people as you do so. And I think that the more I have done this work, the more, I initially worked moving from NASA to USAID to another very large Green Group. And there, I was just kind of immersed in this world of like, land conservation, animal conservation, yes, get pollution down. And I really just, and even in my private life, even though I was very engaged locally in organizing around equity and justice issues, I hadn't really made the connection. And so for me, probably like around, 8 or 9 years ago, I started realizing that like, that is not a way to win. Like ultimately it really matters whether people can afford food and water and pay their bills. And, like that is the, like in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's always going to come first, and it should come first. And so whatever solutions we have must first address those things that people have to take care of each other, and then get to a place where we are able to take on the power structure that is hurting all of our communities. And that means working together in solidarity and organizing.
Yeah, I mean, change is hard, right? I mean, we've all seen this with some of the constructs that are happening between police departments and racial justice. It's all the same kinds of problems, really. You have structures that have been built that may or may not be inclusive, and the ones that have not been inclusive, we have to work to make those more transparent and more understanding of the details of what it takes to really build community. We're not going to win this if we're just talking about, everybody should go to wind. I've had activists that have, wanted to go talk to people in Eastern Kentucky and say, why don't you build wind farms? Well, you have to understand where they're at, and you have to be able to live where their experiences have been. It's not just a matter of wanting to change. It's a matter of that the constructs have made it very difficult for them to change. And if we don't fundamentally understand that first, then we're just going to keep beating our heads against the wall, asking for change that isn't happening the way we want it to happen. I see there's one more question. How important have the various United Nations initiatives such as Paris Accords, IPCC, UN Climate Conference, et cetera, in promoting the climate crisis discussion where we are today? Great question, Bill. Keya?
Yeah, I mean, if the UN didn't already exist, we would have to invent it to deal with the climate crisis. We have a truly global crisis on our hands, and the Paris Accords were a huge breakthrough. They were all designed around the United States, though. All these agreements are designed around the United States, and what could the United States finally agree to? And so they're very bottom up. They have no enforcement. They have no teeth, essentially. So they're critically important in terms of saying, like, yes, all the global leaders came together and said, we cannot allow more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels because there's too much human sacrifice on the other side of that. We are way off track to be meeting those targets, but we are still trying very hard. And all the heads of state agreed that that is what we're going to do. That's really, really important. And I think it's also, it became really important even when the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement to show that like we were the only country. Everyone else in the world is on board with this. And so I think it shows a directionality that sends signals, but ultimately this is a struggle that is going to be won nation by nation by organizing from the ground up. And we need all of you. We need everybody to engage if we are going to succeed, because we don't have a top-down structure on this planet. We don't have a UN Secretary General who can say like, you know what? We need, every country is just gonna have to invest in rails for people to get around and trains and buses, and we're gonna have to do regenerative agriculture that isn't just like raping the land, and you're gonna have to do that. Like if we could do that, then we know what the solutions are, and we know the solutions are better for us, create more jobs, save lives, but we don't have that. So what we have to have is a movement from the ground up that becomes more powerful than the militant white nationalists that have a great deal of power, through their approaches, and that also have strong allies in some very wealthy elites who stand to make money from the status quo and from not changing. And so we have to build up our power in every country in the world in order to be stronger than our opposition and in order to get this done. So it's super important that we have the UN, super important that we have the Paris Accords. It tells us where we're heading, and it gives us confidence that every country is heading that direction. But if we want to win, we got to do it from the bottom up.
And it's so important for people to realize that you don't have to depend either on large organizations or even large networks all the time either. I depend on people on the ground in the communities where they live that are calling me up and saying, hey, I've got a problem here. What do I do about it? And then I can say, you know what, I've heard the same problem from 5 other people. Let's all talk. And that's really where it all starts. So people being vocal, people being engaged, being signed up to vote. Don't think you don't have a voice just because you feel like you may be one lone wolf in a sea where nobody's listening to you. There are places that you can go where there are others with your same problems. And so, I want to encourage people to check out the Arm in Arm initiative that Keya mentioned. Keep in touch with your local organizations like ours, Kentucky Conservation Committee. There are ways to connect, and we know how to get you connected. Do we have any other questions? I'll toss it back over to our host.
Thank you. Thank you, Lane and Keya, so much for that really fascinating and very nuanced conversation, and really for the inspirational last minute thoughts. I think for too long, the climate change has really been messaged and been treated as a separate topic from all the somewhat more mainstream issues of poverty, inequality, and all these things. But as you have all just highlighted today, that these are all interconnected and they are very much tied to our own choices and our own habits. So I really appreciate both of you sharing those thoughts with us. And just to wrap it up, I just want to get your last minute thoughts on, has anything changed for you with the new administration? We talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but really love to hear your thoughts of, has this administration made your work a little easier, harder, or no change, and or priorities? Just some thoughts from you.
In some ways, it's no change because it's more than just who's at the top of the food chain. It's more than just the president, although the president certainly sets the tone. I deal with lawmakers on the very local level, and I encourage people to even go farther down to city councils. There are the same challenges exist at every level, and sometimes you're going to have people on your side and sometimes you're not. And so when we have a favorable administration, I shift my focus to another level where there are still challenges. It doesn't really change it in my book.
I would say it's changed my it has changed my mood so dramatically that it has made my organizing a lot more effective.
There is that.
That helps. Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. I think it certainly helps, gets you a little bit more inspired to do the work even more. Well, again, thank you both for your thoughts today. And as we said, we can all be a lot more thoughtful about how our own actions, choices, and habits affect the overall environment, and also find ways to support organizations like USCAN and Kentucky Conservation Committee, and policies that impact climate change positively for the generations to come. So with that, I want to thank the World Affairs Councils of America for highlighting the importance of climate change this week, and including our council in Kentucky in this series. So I want to again thank everyone for joining us, and wish you all a very happy weekend. And we look forward to seeing all of you next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.